Hi, I'm Ashley from Sunny Maid, and today we are going to bind our quilt. Welcome back. We are on our last and final step of getting our quilt all put together. I'm excited. Are you excited? Okay, this month 9, we did our stashing, week 1, week 2, gotta pull my other one out that actually has the border on it. We did borders. Week 3, I talked to you about how to put a quilt sandwich together and how to get your quilt quilted. And last, it's time to finish up that raw edge and get it all done. So what we want to do to start off with is after we have quilted it, we want to make sure that we trim off all the extras, especially if you've done a long arm. And that is where my microphone quit, and the rest of my footage that I filmed is with nothing on it. So I'm going to try to do a quick re-video of what I had talked to you guys about. Hopefully I remember it all, because it was, well, even if it was, well, I think it was about 2 weeks ago that I did it. There's a lot happening since then. So hopefully I can remember what everything I talked about. And I'm going to have to use a different quilt because the one I was showing you on is already bound. So I'm going to show you on this one, just to talk about the edges, and hopefully we will move on and get it all bound. Okay, so what I was saying was, when you bring it back from the long arm, there is going to be an unfinished edge all the way around. And the backing is going to stick, the backing and the batting are going to stick out farther than the edge of the quilt. So your first thing that you need to do is take a big long straight edge and your cutting mat and a rotary cutter, and you are going to trim off right along the edge of your quilt top. Okay, and this will just give you a nice finished edge. Well, it's not exactly finished, but it'll give you a nice smooth edge all the way around your quilt. If the long arm was done right, you should also have a seam that is right at the edge of your quilt top all the way around your quilt. So that'll help us when we go to put our binding on. I want to talk to you a little bit about different types of binding. So I'm just going to have you guys do strips. It's super easy to do that way. I learned how to make binding on the bias so that when you have a piece of fabric, your strips actually go diagonal. It does give it a little stretch, which helps. It's really good for something that has like a wavy edge. I also like it if you have vertical stripes and you cut them on the bias, then you get a stripe all the way around the edge of your quilt. So it's kind of fun to use. I'm not going to go into too in-depth of that right now. We're just going to do a nice straight cut down the width of our fabric. So the next thing we want to do is decide how wide we want our binding. Usually I do a faux double binding, which is what I did here. I'm going to teach you just a basic binding today, so nothing fancy. But I also like a thin binding along the edge, and that is personal preference. And the other thing is what color do you want the edge of it? What do you want it to look like? On most of my quilts, I like to have something that sticks out. Like on this one is something that comes from the middle of the quilt, but also is not the same color as the edge. On this one here, I have so many fun colors in it I have leftover of my backing, and I think I might actually just use that. So an orange along the edge is going to be super fun because my oranges are, if you want to see, this is a quarter of the quilt. So the oranges aren't near the edge. It's mostly greens and teals. And so it would be a fun thing to put on the edge of the quilt. So what I picked for our quilt here is I picked it from this fabric line. It is a Marbella fabric, which is all the colors that I've used. I just went to the quilt store to see what they had left because it was a blender that cycled out. And so I ended up with this yellow green. It's not my favorite, but it definitely works on the edge of the quilt. So it pulls all the colors away from the edge. Okay, so today I'm going to teach you how to do a binding that is 2.5 inches. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut strips of fabric at 2.5 inches from our binding fabric, okay? And then we are going to, they're going to be 2.5 inches by the width of fabric, okay? Then we're going to fold it in half, wrong sides together. We're going to machine sew it on one side of the quilt, fold it over to the other side, and I'm a little lazy. The truth is by the time I get to this part of the quilt, the binding, I want my quilt to be done. So I normally machine bind my binding all the way around it. Some people like to hand stitch, and that's fine. If you would rather do that, that's fine. I don't like to sit there and do that. So I just want my quilt to be done. So that's what we're going to do. Now we got to decide how much strips, how many strips we need to cut from our binding fabric. Our quilt, this one doesn't have the border on it. This one does. Let's pull this one out. This one we decided was 36, 40, 44.25 inches wide on all four sides. And we needed to go all the way around. Unfortunately, 44.5 inches is slightly more than a width of fabric. Generally, a width of fabric is 43 to 44 inches wide, and then you need to cut off your salvage edge. So you will need 4 strips of 2.5 inch wide pieces that are the width of fabric. So if you're going to the quilt store and you're buying binding fabric, you would need at least 12.5 inches. So 12 inches is 1/3 of a yard. I would definitely do it a little bit more than that. Okay, so if you're going to the quilt store, you don't want 1/3, which is 12 inches. 3/8 of a yard is 12.5 inches. So that is right at where we need, assuming they cut it straight. You could get away with 3/8 of a yard, but you might want to get a half a yard just so you make sure you have enough. Okay, so what we're going to do is first we want to iron this nice and flat because we don't want any creases in it. And then we're going to take it to our cutting mat and cut it 2.5 inches by the width of fabric. The rest of this video, I did do a voiceover because like I said, my microphone went out. I think I covered everything, but I'm not really sure. One thing I was going to say about it is that when I machine sew the first part of the binding onto the quilt, I like to sew it on the front. And the reason being is that if I sew it on the front and flip it to the back, then the pretty side is on the front. Okay, now with this one that has the faux double, I start with it on the back and I flip it to the front. But with this single binding, we're going to sew it onto the front so that when we flip it around to the back, the pretty side is on the front, which is what everybody's going to see. Not very many people come and go, oh look, her binding is not very good over here on this side. They're not going to do that. So that's why we want to sew it onto the front of the quilt and flip it around. Okay, so go and get your 5 strips cut out 2.5 inches by width of fabric. Get that salvaged edge trimmed off, and I'm going to show you how we're going to sew those strips together to create your binding. Here we have our 5 strips of 2.5 inch fabric. These are width of fabric by 2.5 inches, and if you notice here, I trimmed off the salvage edge. Now that we have them all cut, it is time for us to sew them together. We are going to sew them on a diagonal so that it lays flatter along the edge of a quilt. When we fold it in half like this and wrap it around the edge, if we don't fold it on the diagonal, it's going to be a big bunching right at that edge, which is why we do it on the diagonal. So first we're going to take one strip and lay it horizontal, and then we're going to take a second strip with right sides together and lay it on top of it vertical so that it overlaps roughly 1/4 inch. We can use a ruler, as you can see here, to see if we are close to that 1/4 inch, and that looks good. So now I'm going to draw a line from where it crosses from corner to corner. And this is actually our sew line, and we are going to sew along that edge and then trim off the corner pieces. I'm going to pin it into place so it doesn't move, and we are sewing right on that line, not off of it, but right on it. And we are going to combine all of these pieces together the same way. We are then going to trim 1/4 inch off of that line, and we're going to trim off this excess fabric. And then when we fold it back after it's been sewn, it shows this nice, neat line. Now that we have all 5 strips sewn together on the diagonal, and then having trimmed off those corner pieces, we have a nice seam, as you can see here. Now we need to take it to the iron and iron right along that edge so it creates a nice long piece of fabric. Make sure that you don't get the other pieces all crinkled in there as you iron it. So we're going to iron at each seam so that it lays nice and flat. Now that we have those seams together, it is time to fold it in half. We are going to put wrong sides together and iron it in half all the way down the length of each strip. And what this will allow us to do is to hook it on one side of the quilt and then fold it over the edge and hook it on the other side of the quilt. So we are just going to lay it horizontal on our ironing mat, and we are going to line up those raw edges, wrong sides together, and then we are going to iron it the full length of the fabric. When I'm done, I like to roll it up onto something like this pin. The pin is really nice because you can hook it to that tab on the pin, and then you just spin the pin as you roll it around. And then if we take out the pin, we have a nice round circle for us to be able to use it. Now that we have our binding all put together, it's time to start attaching it to our quilt. We are going to attach it to the front of the quilt, and that's my favorite because I like it to look nice and neat on the front. So what we're going to do is have a tail at the beginning that's roughly, about 8 inches. And we are going to line that raw edge up with the side of the quilt and pin it into place. It is then going to follow along the edge of the quilt and go towards the corner. Now the corner can get a little tricky. We want to make sure that we get a nice flat corner. So we go to the corner and we're going to pin it into place. I actually saw a really cool tutorial lately or recently about this, so I'm going to try it out. When we get to the corner, we're going to fold it up away so it creates that 45-degree angle, and then fold it back down. Well, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin here so that it stays into place. That's probably a good idea. And then it'll be a little easier when we go to fold it down. So then we're going to fold it down and run it along the edge. So here in the corner, you're just going to see it overlapping. But as you can see here, that fold is right at the edge of the corner. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this into place as well. And then it's going to run down the corner. Oh, I don't like it there. Let me put in a different spot, because you got to be able to sew down the edge of the quilt and then have your pins be in the right spot so they're not getting in the way. Okay, this looks a lot better. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew from that first pin that I put in. We're going to use a 1/4 inch, go down around the top, do the corner, and go down the other side. Let's do a close-up. Now, one of my favorite tricks here is to use a 1/4 inch sewing foot. What this does is it gives me an edge so that when I go to sew, I can line the edge of my quilt right up with the edge of that foot. We are going to start at that first pin that we put in and just start on the other side of it, or move the pin out of the way like I did and lower the foot. As you can see, that quilt is just going to run right along the edge of that sewing foot, which just makes a perfect 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to take this nice and slow, make sure that I do it right along the edge. This is probably one of the only places that I'll backstitch, but I do like to backstitch to make sure that when I am hooking the two ends together, it stays in place. So here we go. We want to make sure that our seams are getting tucked in the right direction. We go nice and slow. We want to make sure that our quilt isn't getting sewn in the wrong spot. So make sure that it's nice and flat underneath that foot. And we're going to go all the way to the edge of the quilt until you're about a 1/4 inch from the edge of your quilt. And at that point, we are going to stop sewing because we need to create room for the seam going in the other direction. So I'm going to go to up to a 1/4 inch of that edge. We're going to stop. I am going to backstitch here, and then I'm going to pull my foot out, pull it out of the sewing machine, and I'm going to do that corner that I showed you in the last picture. Fold it over at that 45-degree angle, and then fold it down so that it lines up once again with the edge of the quilt. We are going to start sewing right at the edge of that quilt. Do a little back stitch if you would like. Make sure your quilt and your binding is all lying flat so that it is out of the way and it doesn't get in a weird position. We want to make sure that we are not having to seam rip. Who really wants to seam rip? So now we're just going to go down the edge of the quilt. We're going to repeat that process on all 4 sides and just continue until we get to the other part of the quilt. And here's just a fast version of me. I'm going to do the corner, and then I'm going to go all 4 sides of the quilt until there's probably about a 10-inch opening between where I started sewing and where I end sewing. And that's mainly because we need to hook the 2 pieces together. Now that we've gotten to the other end of the quilt, we want to make sure that we also have a tail about 8 inches back stitch right there so that it will stay in place as we hook those the binding together to create a nice flat look. Okay, as you can see here, we have our binding sewn all the way around. We have back stitched here, and we have an opening that is roughly 8 inches, and there is a tail on each end, which we can overlap. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay them over on the top of each other. Once again, we're going to do a diagonal seam for this binding so that it lays nice and flat. As you can see here, there is a diagonal seam already, which is going to kind of get in the way, but we're going to try to work around it and make it work. So we're going to get our ruler and measure from, or put a pin in at the edge of the ruler. Then we are going to measure over 2.5 inches, because that is how wide our binding is. We know that we cut it at 2.5 inches. Okay, so I put a pin on each side. We are going to trim that top one on the pin on the right, and we are going to trim that bottom one on that pin on the bottom. And what that will do is that will allow us, I'm actually going to measure back 3 inches, because that will give us a seam allowance. So 3 inches from that one pin, so they're overlapping 3 inches. Okay, I hope that's understanding. So here we have them both trimmed, they're in the right position. We're now going to open them up so that they are laying flat, and we are going to put them at a 90-degree angle, just like we did when we pieced together the rest of the pieces. It's going to be a little bit tricky because we have a whole quilt to work with now, but we want, once again, to have a hangover of about a 1/4 inch on the side and the top, just like we did when we were piecing the strips together. And if you need to, put a ton of pins there so that they will lay out of the way. I'm just going to adjust this a little bit because it is sometimes difficult. Get your folded up so we can make this lay flat. So once we have the pins in the way, if you can, I want you to draw a line. Oh, yep. Let's measure it, make sure that it looks good. We're going to draw a line from where they overlap on each corner. So it's a diagonal line, just like we did when we were attaching the pieces together. And then we're going to sew right along that diagonal line. We're going to then trim off the corners, just like we did when we were piecing together the binding, and iron it open and flat. So let's get my straight edge. We're going to try to do this left-handed, or over the top. It's just difficult with all the quilts in the way. I'm going to try to draw a line as well as possible. Again, we are sewing on the line, and let's get it sewn and trimmed off. So here we have it sewn, and now I'm just going to take scissors and trim off roughly a 1/4 inch from that seam. And now, as you can see, it lays nice and flat along our quilt. We are going to then sew right that binding down right along the edge, and here we have it all sewn on and nice and flat. So now we are going to press it away from the quilt and wrap it around the edge of the quilt. I do like to press it if that's because it does lay flatter. But let me show you what it's going to look like on the back. So we have our binding here, and then we are going to flip it over, and I'm going to use these cool binder clips, and they are actually made especially for quilts, and I'm going to pull it over and pin them into place. And as we get to the corner, this is that technique I was talking to you about. First, what I'm going to need is a pin, and we're going to fold over that vertical binding first, get it hooked into place. You can use pins if you have pins, that's fine. These binder clips, I do have a link in the bio. I'm going to use a pin to fold a nice straight edge. And then as you fold it down, you see how it gives you that cool miter corner. So that is the technique, and it looks like it is working great. So what I'm going to do now is when I take it to the sewing machine, I'm going to stitch in the ditch on the other side of the quilt, and it's going to catch that edge on the back of the quilt so that the front will look nice and pretty, and the back is going to catch that binding. So if we flip it over here, you can see that if we stitch right in that ditch, the ditch is that space between the white and the binding. We stitch in the ditch, it's going to automatically catch the back of that binding. And we are just going to continue stitching in the ditch all the way around. I do have a specific foot for my sewing machine that does quilt stitch right in the ditch. I can line it up and it'll be nice and neat. So that would be another tool that would come in handy besides the 1/4 inch foot, but that stitch in the ditch foot, which will allow you to sew right in that seam. Okay, so I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, get it all sewn up, get these last things trimmed, and I'll meet you back here. All right, and here we have our finished quilt. We've got our binding on it. As a whole, I think we did pretty good. If you look at the back, it doesn't look as nice as the front, which is why we start with sewing it on the front. I did notice a few places over here that I missed catching the back as I sewed, but I picked it out a little bit and I thought it was perfect because I did just get some quilt labels and I didn't sew one in. So I'm going to hook my quilt label on and get one put in here and get that all fixed. Okay, any questions, please put them in the comment section below. I would love to come and answer them. If you want to check out the feet that I was using on my sewing machine, I do have links to the tools I use down in the description box. Send you over to Amazon. You can check them out. Other than that, let's do show and tell. So I showed you last week that I was working on a quilt. That looks like this, Modernly Morgan. I have a whole stack. That's the designer of the quilt pattern. The fabric is Bonnie and Camille. So I have a whole stack. This is my basket of things and my leftover fabric. So this is all I have left to put together, and then we're going to put them together to create a nice big quilt. So I'm super excited about that. Last week, my favorite local quilt store moved to this brand new building, and they now have the opportunity to rent long arms. So I went and long armed this. I'm just learning how to free motion, and if you ask me, I think I'm doing pretty good. So I like loops. This is what I did a couple of double loops and single loops, and so that's the quilt I was showing you earlier in the video. So this is it. I used what is this fabric? Jungle Paradise by Stacy Eastsu. I don't know if I said that right. I'm always worried that I'm going to say her name wrong. And this was Entropy. See, I don't know how to pronounce these names, but who did this? Squats and Running Stitches, I think, is what her handle is on Instagram. She did a quilt along or a sew long. I don't know if it was last year or the year before. But that's what this is. I'm glad that I finally got it put together. I just need to find it. Do you know how many quilts I have that need to be bound? So I like to do all kinds of different things. I'm not just a quilter. I'm very much a crafter and a builder as well. So the other thing that I got done this week is I finished this bookshelf, and a friend had given it to me it was a gray color and I was sanding it, and the sanding wasn't going very well. So I sanded it down as much as I could, and then I painted it this dark blue color. If you're interested, it's a Home Depot Bear poppy seed. In the garage, it looked really dark, and I was afraid it was going to be awful. But so I'm trying to put together a space for my videos, make it look pretty. I'll probably move my quilt here up so you can see all of it. I'm trying to decide if I want to put fabric here or quilts. I think it would be fun either way. So yeah, this was another thing that I worked on this week. Okay, so that's what I'm working on. My daughter wanted to learn how to sew, so we went and got some little mini charm squares, and we were making blankets for her Barbie dolls, so that was a lot of fun this week. And other than that, that's it. I hope you have a great week. Next week, I'm going to do a giveaway. I think I'm going to give away one of the quilts that we were just working on, probably this one since it's all put together. And so come back next week and I'll tell you how to enter. Hope you have a great day. Happy sewing.